All right, good evening. So we are continuing with chapter 12, social psychology. And this is going to be part 2 of the lecture. Part 1 is already posted, so you should be able to view that if you need. And where we're going to start tonight is with conformity, compliance, and obedience. And we're going to talk about Solomon Asch and the Asch effect, Stanley Milgram and his obedience studies. We will briefly talk about groupthink and group polarization. All right, so this is actually, when I'm meeting in person in class, I usually will put together this, this experiment. I'll try to recreate Solomon Asch's work. And usually, I'll be honest, what I usually do is we'll get some Confederates. Those are students that will agree to participate in the experiment that will purposely give the wrong answer. And when I've done this in the classroom, it's actually been kind of fun and funny. It's kind of hard to do that in this environment. So what I'm going to do is kind of show you a video of Asch's experiment. And so basically what it is, you know, the person that is the subject of the experiment is asked to, after hearing everyone else's answers, is asked to decide which line, A, B, or C, closely resembles line X. And usually what happens is that the Confederates will have all said either A or B, right? And then kind of leaves the subject of the experiment a little perplexed and experience the peer pressure of conformity. So, but couldn't set that up for tonight. So we're going to do the video here.
Okay, I want to give you a test of your visual acuity, your sensitivity to differences in line lengths. So I'm going to show you a standard, and then I'm going to show you 3 comparison lines. One is going to be bigger, one is going to be shorter, and one is going to be the same size as the standard. Your job is, tell me which line, A, B, or C, is the same as the standard. Seems like a simple judgment. You always get it right. But now, before you give your answer, there are going to be half dozen to 10 other people like you in the room, and they're going to give their answers first. An amazing thing happens. One after another, they say the line that you see as shorter is the same as the standard. Shorter, 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 shorter. They don't say shorter, they just say B, 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 and so forth. Now it's your turn. You know B is the wrong answer. But what do you say? In this study done by Solomon Asch, a classic study of group conformity, the majority of people gave in on most of the critical trials to agree with, to say publicly that they agreed with the majority. So this study is one of the first classic studies on the power of a group. As long as there's 3 or more people who agree among themselves that reality is not the way you see it, in many cases you give in to see the world in their way. Let's look at that study.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the 5th person with the white T-shirt. The others are Confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2,
2,
2,
2,
2, 3, 3,
3, 3.
But on the 3rd trial, something happens.
2, 2,
2,
2.
2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
1.
Ash found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1.
1.
They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me.
1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1.
1.
1.
2. 1.
2.
2.
2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2. 2.
2.
2.
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group. In this variation, Ash gave the naive subject a partner, here seated in the 3rd position, who also gives the correct response.
1.
1. 2. 1.
2.
With a partner, yielding drops to only 5% of the critical trials compared to 37% without a partner. Although subjects report warmth and good feeling toward the partner, they typically deny that he played a role in their own independence. The partnership variation shows that much of the power of the group came not merely from its numbers, but from the unanimity of its opposition. When that unanimity is punctured, the group's power is greatly reduced. Sometimes we go along with the group because what they say convinces us they are right. This is called informational conformity. But sometimes we conform because we are apprehensive that the group will disapprove if we are deviant. This is called normative conformity. The strength of the normative factor is shown in another variation carried out by Ash. In this variation, the subject is told that because he had arrived late, he would have to write his answers. Subjects in this private response experiment are exposed to the same amount of misleading information as other subjects, but they are immune from any possible criticism by the group.
1. 1.
1.
And this enormously reduces the pressure to conform. Conformity drops by 2/3. Ash's experiment is a classic. It reveals how people will deny what they see and submit to group pressure. It allows us not only to observe conformity, but to study the conditions that increase or reduce its occurrence.
Okay.
All right. So what you've been watching is known as the Ash effect, right? And as it was explained, the influence of the group majority, what the impact on an individual's judgment, right? And a lot of the statistics that are mentioned here were talked about in the video. But what is really important to kind of point out is the greater the majority, the more likely the individual will conform. So bigger numbers, more conformity. And then, of course, the presence of another dissenter causes that to actually drop. And as they said in the video, you know, when that unanimity is pierced, right? When there's a crack in the wall, so to speak, it actually makes it easier for the non-conformity to occur. And then lastly, the public versus the private nature of the responses. So you'll notice that you could kind of see what he was writing down, but he was writing down all the correct answers. And he didn't have to present it. And therefore, he wasn't subject to that same peer pressure, wasn't worried about being criticized, anything like that, right? And so here we have a picture of voting machines, right? And so, you know, the vote, for instance, is private, and that's the reason why it's designed to reduce pressure. In California, that's why poll watchers, there's like rules around campaigning within a certain distance from a polling place, right? To give people free and equal access without having that pressure, without having someone looking over your shoulder, etc. So, yeah, so Antonio points out that this type of practice is generally displayed in jury trials. Yes, that is one place where you could see the Ash effect occurring. Yeah, absolutely. You can see it in lots of different places too, right? So jury trials, in the classroom there, with voting. I'm trying to think of another example. If you're doing a group project with other students, it might show up there. Yeah, so. And then the other, excuse me, terms that they brought up in the video was the normative influence, right? The normative social influence. And that will be a term that I want you to remember, as well as the informational social influence, right? And so with normative, sorry, I keep saying it wrong, normative social influence, people conform to the group norm to fit in, to feel good, right? To be accepted. It's one of those unique things with humans as social creatures, right? We want to be accepted. We want to feel good. We want to feel like we fit in. A little bit later on, we're going to talk about the difference between in-group and out-group and stuff like that. And then informational social influence is when people conform because they believe the group is competent. They believe that the information is correct. And this is particularly true when the task or the situation is ambiguous, right? When there's no clear path. So. The next video I'm going to show you is also very interesting, and it's on obedience. And this was conducted by Stanley Milgram. It's another name you're going to want to remember. Earlier, I used the term Confederate. You see it here again. That will probably be a term that you will see on the exam. You'll want to remember what a Confederate is. And basically, that's a person who's in on the experiment. They know kind of what's happening. In this case, the Confederates were the learners that you'll see in the video. So approximately 65% of the participants in the video you're about to watch in the actual experiments continued to administer shocks even after the learner or the Confederate in the other room stopped responding. So, and this is another example of how authority and authority figures can play a big part. You know, at the beginning last week, when we first started this chapter, I kind of rhetorically asked the question, what is it that makes good people do bad things, right? And we looked at social role, and we looked at Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. We looked at what happened at Abu Ghraib in Iraq, which, basically the Stanford prison experiment kind of predicted that something like this could happen. And lo and behold, it did, right? So here's another example of obedience and authority figures and what this may be predictive of as well.
It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area. They were obtained by a newspaper advertisement and direct mail solicitation. The subjects range in occupation from corporation presidents to good humor men and plumbers, and in educational level from one who had not finished elementary school to subjects who have doctorate and other professional degrees.
Right here. Now, both of you have been paid, so let me sit right down. So let me say that the checks are yours simply for showing up at the lab. And from this point on, no matter what happens, the money is yours. I should like to tell both of you a little about the memory project. Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn various types of material. Some of the better-known theories are treated in the book over there, The Teaching and Learning Process by Cantor. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake. A common application of this theory would be when parents spank a child who does something wrong. But actually, we know very little about the effect of punishment on learning because almost no truly scientific studies have been made of it in human beings. For instance, we don't know how much punishment is best for learning. And we don't know how much difference it makes as to who's giving the punishment, whether an adult learns best from an older or a younger person himself, and many things of this sort. So what we're doing in the project is bringing together a number of adults of different occupations and ages, and we're asking some of them to be teachers and some to be learners. We want to find out just what effect different people have on each other as teachers and learners, and also what effect punishment will have on learning in this situation. Therefore, I'm going to ask one of you to be the teacher here this afternoon, and the other to be the learner. This machine generates electric shocks. When you press one of the switches all the way down, the learner gets a shock. When you release it, the shock stops, you see, like that. The switch will remain in this middle position after you've released it to show you which switches you've used on the board. Of course, if you were to press any one of them again, the learner would get another shock.
All subjects are given identical instructions and a sample shock.
I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and estimate the number of volts you receive in the sample shock. Do not open your eyes until I tell you to do so, please. Close them now. Okay, you may open your eyes, and using the voltage scale here, would you estimate for me the number of volts you receive, please? You may also use the verbal designations, slight, moderate, strong, so forth, to help you. Say a number, please. Would you? About 75. 75. No, actually, it was 45 here. Although it may have seemed stronger because of the electrode paste, which provides a perfect contact. All right, let's go on to our instructions. We will begin with this test. You will read each pair of words in this list once to the learner until you've read through the entire list. Direct your voice toward that microphone as the rooms are partially soundproof. After you've read through the list once, you will go on to the next page. And here, starting from line A, you'll read the word in large letters along with each of the other words in the line. For example, in the first line, you read blue, boy, girl, grass, hat. Now, after you've read the four choices, the learner pushes one of the switches on the board in front of him, and the number he has selected will light up in this box, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Now, if he gives the correct answer, you say correct and go on to the next line. The correct answer is underlined and is also indicated in the right margin. Yeah. If he were to indicate the wrong answer, you would say wrong. Then tell him the number of volts you're going to give him. Then give him the punishment. Then read the correct word pair once. And then go on to the next line. For example, if he indicated 3 for blue, you would say wrong. 15 volts. You press and release the switch. Read blue girl, and then go on to the next line. I see. Now, each time he gives a wrong answer, you move up one switch on the shock generator. I see. And it's important that you follow this procedure exactly. So to help you, let me go through it again very quickly. All right. I would suggest you read the list and the test at a brisk pace to keep it moving.
The victim was an accomplice of the experimenter. The drawing was rigged so that the naive subject was always the teacher, and the accomplice always became the learner.
Of 100 people placed in this situation, how many do you think would just go right on to the end? And Mr. Wallace were out there, and say Mr. Williams, for some reason or other, said, keep going.
You're asking me how many people?
Out of 100, right.
Well, personally, I think if you get 1 or 2, you'd be lucky.
Well, I'm not sure lucky is the right word.
40 psychiatrists at a leading medical school were also asked to predict the performance of 100 hypothetical subjects. They predicted that only a little more than 1/10 of 1% of the subjects would administer the highest shock on the board. Yet actually, 50% of the subjects obeyed the experimenter's commands fully in the experiment depicted in this film.
165 volts. Time. That guy's hollering in there.
Continue, please. Go on.
There's a lot of them here, you know. They have a heart condition there. You want me to go?
Just continue, please.
Sharp. Axe, needle, stick, blade. Answer, please. Wrong. I'm up to 180 volts.
Please continue, teacher.
Needle, you're going to get a shock. 180 volts. You can't stand it now. I'm not going to kill that man there. You hear him hollering there?
As I said before, the shocks may be painful, but they're not dangerous.
They're hollering. He can't stand it. What if something happens to him?
The experiment requires that you continue, teacher.
Yeah, but I'm not going to get that man sick in there. I mean, he's hollering in there. You know what I mean?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until he's learned all the word pairs.
I refuse to take the responsibility of getting hurt in there. I mean, he's in there hollering.
It's absolutely essential that you continue, teacher.
There's too many left here, and I mean, geez, he gets wrong here. There's too many of them left. I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow. Wrong. Answer is neck. 300 volts.
I absolutely refuse to answer anymore. Get me out of here. You can't hold me here. Get me out. Get me out of here.
Continue. The next word is green, please.
Green, grass, hat, ink, apple. I can't go on. He won't answer.
If the learner doesn't answer in a reasonable time, about 4 or 5 seconds, consider the answer wrong and follow the same procedures you have been doing for wrong answers. Say wrong, tell them the number of volts, give them the punishment, read them the correct answer.
Oh, man.
Continue, please.
Something's happened to that man in there. Nice one, gold, dollar, necklace, moon, paint. Something's happened to that man in there. You better check in on him, sir. He won't answer me or nothing.
Please continue. Go on, please.
You accept all the responsibility?
The responsibility is mine, correct. Please go on.
Grave, woman, soldier, dog, horse. Answer is woman, 450 volts. That's it.
Now continue using the last switch on the board, please. The 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please.
I'm not getting no answer.
Please continue. The next word is white.
But you think you should look in on him, please?
Not once we've started the experiment.
But what if something's happened to the man, had an attack or something there?
The experiment requires that we continue. Go on, please.
Don't the man's health mean anything?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we must...
But he might be dead in there. I mean, some people can't take this shock, sir.
Please
continue. I don't tend to be rude, but I mean, I think you should look in on him. All you got to do is look at the door. I don't get no answer, no noise, something I think has happened to the gentleman in there, sir.
We must continue. Go on, please.
You're going to keep giving him, what, 450 volts every shot now?
That's correct. Continue. The next word is white.
White, 450 volts. Next one is short. Sentence, movie, skirt, time.
All right, excuse me, teacher. We'll have to discontinue the experiment. I'd like to ask you a few questions, if I may. How do you feel, though?
I feel all right, but I don't like what's happened to that fellow in there. He's been hollering, and we had to keep giving him shocks. I didn't like that one bit. I mean, he wanted to get out, and he just kept going, kept throwing 450 volts. I didn't like that. He wouldn't even look at on that gentleman.
Well, who was actually pushing the switch?
I was. But he kept insisting. I told him no, but he said he's got to keep going. I told him it's time we stopped when we got up to 195, 210 volts.
But why didn't you just stop?
You wouldn't let me. I wanted to stop.
Many people, not knowing much about the experiment, claim that subjects who go to the end of the board are sadistic. Nothing could be more foolish as an overall characterization of these persons. The context of their action must always be considered. The individual, upon entering the laboratory, becomes integrated into a situation that carries its own momentum. The results, as I observe them in the laboratory, are disturbing. They raise the possibility that human nature cannot be counted on to insulate men from brutality and inhumane treatment at the direction of malevolent authority. A substantial proportion of people do what they are told to do, irrespective of the content of the act and without limitations of conscience, so long as they perceive that the command comes from a legitimate authority. If in this study an anonymous experimenter could successfully command adults to subdue a 50-year-old man and force on him painful electric shocks against his protests, one can only wonder what government, with its vastly greater authority and prestige, can command of its subjects.
All right, so kind of a interesting video and interesting experiment.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Betty.
Yeah, I mean, I say yes, I corroborate with you. It's interesting, but sadly, I mean, true.
Yeah, you know, and this is kind of what I alluded to last week, and in part one was when I asked the rhetorical question about, you know, what makes good people do bad things. You know, kind of like to think about it. You know, there's, you know, as they were talking about looking at the situation and the context and the authority, and what we're seeing is that most people will follow an authority figure that they think is legitimate. You know, and so it can explain some of the tragedies that we have seen in the past. Yeah. Any other thoughts on the two experiments that we kind of watched?
The guy experienced some empathy for the other person, even though he don't know him. I mean,
absolutely, right? And there's a perfect example of what I'm saying. You know, what makes a good person do something that is potentially causing harm to another human being? He was protesting, absolutely. And yet he still succumbed to the authority. He still, after the protests, no matter how long he did it, he still applied, going all the way to the maximum voltage. Yeah. All right. And so, you know, the next thing to think about here is groupthink and group polarization. And you can kind of see how groupthink can kind of occur, right? So the definition that I want you to remember for groupthink is when an individual modifies their opinion, right, to align with the consensus of the group. So if the majority of the group believes one way, that individual, who may or may not, will change, or they will modify their opinions to kind of meet where the group is at, right? And the other thing to think about here too is that groups often take actions that individuals would not normally perform, right, outside of the group setting. There's something that happens with a group of people that is, well, they described it in the video like the momentum of the group when we were looking at the Ash effect, right? Once the momentum of the group gets started, conformity became paramount, right? It's the same thing with groupthink and some of the actions that might happen in a group situation. And then, of course, there is group polarization, which is the strengthening of the original group attitude after discussion of the views within the group, right? And then here's a question. Does your opinion change if you find someone attractive but your friends do not agree. What do you guys think of that question? Oh, got a chat. It's either a question or an answer. Let's see. Let's see. Reminds me of the military and taking orders. LOL, but they'd have to be lawful, of course. Yeah, and that brings up a good point. And you know, and the thing with the military, which very interesting point. First of all, the military is a dictatorship. And you know, anyone that's ever served in the military, you go through boot camp, they kind of break you down and build you back up again. And the idea is that you are now a member of the unit, right? Part of that mission. So, yeah, good point. All right, so a couple other terms to learn would be social facilitation and then social loafing, right? And so with social facilitation, that occurs when an individual performs better when an audience is watching them than they would perform if they were doing the behavior alone, right? So this usually occurs when people are performing a task for which they are skilled, or it's an easy task. But if you have stage fright, right, when people are nervous or less skilled, you know, that audience may hinder rather than help, right? So the stage fright, anybody here like ever get stage fright for like giving speeches or presentations, right? You might be experiencing that nervousness or that hindrance as a result of that. And then social loafing is the exertion of less effort by a person when they're working together in a group, which is kind of funny. I often, in a lot of my classes, I will do group projects. During the 8-week course, I usually don't do this, but in the 16-week course, I will usually have one kind of group project. And one of the biggest complaints that I get is not from every group, but there's always at least one group where somebody says, you know what, not so-and-so is not pulling their weight. And which can be unfortunate in a group situation because everyone is graded on the group presentation. And I may not know exactly who did what part in it, right? And everybody will get the same grade. So that can be kind of where social loafing can kind of be irritating to some people. So, and of course, this occurs when individual performance cannot be evaluated separately from the group, which is exactly the example that I just discussed, right? And what's interesting here too is group performance actually declines if the task is easy. However, when the task is difficult, people feel more motivated and believe that their group needs their input to do well on a challenging task, right? So the more difficult, that tends to motivate people to perform better. The easier the task, not so much, right? The performance will decline. All right, so now we're going to enter into like some prejudice and discrimination. We're going to talk about the difference between the two. And we're going to talk about like where it comes from and have a brief discussion on that. So first, let's get some definitions out of the way, right? So prejudice actually is not like a behavior. It's an attitude, it's a feeling, it's a belief system toward a particular individual based on their membership in a particular group, right? So, so a person can be prejudiced and you may never know, right? Discrimination is the actual behavior. It's a negative action that is directed toward an individual because of their membership or, by the way, perceived membership in a particular group, right? And the reason why I say perceived, I'll give you an example. Like someone might be perceived as being gay and they might not be, but the mere perception of that may subject them to discriminatory behavior, right? As an example. And then of course there's the stereotype. That's what we've all heard. We've all heard of stereotypes, which is a specific belief or an assumption about individuals based on their membership in a group, or again, as I say, their perceived membership in a particular group. So why do you guys think discrimination and prejudice exist? Where does it come from? What do you guys think? This is kind of open discussion, and I'm just going to be putting some pictures up. Some might be disturbing. Where does it come from?
I would say family, peers, social media.
Yeah, it can come from that. Yeah, sure can. Any other thoughts?
Family and like even like, you know, fairy tales and stuff, like things we grew up watching.
Yeah. Or even or even games that we played as kids or whatever too. Okay, so I'll give you an example, and I am going to use a derogatory slur. So please forgive me for this. I'm only doing it as an example. But when I was growing up, there was a game called, okay, please forgive me for this. There was a game we used to play, or that would get played, that was called Smear the Queer, right? And so that's another example of like socialization that can happen. You know, and as kids, I can remember when my cousins would love to play that game. And it was basically, you know, it was a physical game, kind of like a wrestling thing, throw balls at people, things like that. It seems harmless, you know, and of course now as an adult, I look back on that and I go, wow, you know, what is the message there? And I also grew up in the South and, you know, heard lots of different slurs for lots of different groups. Let's see. So social learning is one of them, which is kind of what was said earlier. And then one of your fellow students kind of actually posited the question, you know, can it come from religion? Could, depending on what's being taught. And then of course, we've already talked about conformity, haven't we? So conformity to social norms, right? And then, you know, and then looking at these pictures, right? The little girl carrying the white cross with the Confederate battle flag behind her. That's how she is being raised. The kids over here with the God hates fags, right? They're little kids carrying these signs. And so prejudice and discrimination can be hard to eradicate, can't it? But it's important that we understand where it comes from. You know, it's important that we understand for education and how we can move, you know, our society forward. So, any other thought? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sure the kids that are holding those signs, they don't know actually the meaning because, like you mentioned, it's influenced by family and by lack of education. They don't know actually what is meaning, what they try to say it.
Right. Yeah, and they may not. Or their parents may be very graphic with them too. Who knows? Yeah.
Yes, true.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about types of prejudice, right? And discrimination. So first of all, we're talking racism, right? And that's prejudice and discrimination based on individuals' race. And there's two ways that this can happen, right? There's explicit racism. In other words, the person that is engaging in the racism, it's conscious, it's controllable. I'll give you an example. There was a news report last week and a video, I don't know if anybody saw it, in Alabama in a town hall meeting, one of the city commissioners or one of the city elected officials, right, was responding to another one and basically used the N-word out loud, on the record, asked for where the house N-word person was, right? Like, when I saw that, I was like completely shocked, right? It's 2021. That is explicit. That is conscious. That person knows what they're doing. He believes he's right? But it is conscious and it's controllable. Implicit attitudes, right, or implicit racism are those that are more unconscious and uncontrollable. And that can come from some social learning, how a person was raised, right? So if you're not thinking about things in another way, it just kind of gets embedded in there, right? Now, the example that I just gave regarding, and that actually happened, you could probably find, do a Google search and find it. I mean, it was like a month ago, something like that. Most people don't usually show that kind of extreme racial bias. Most people. I will say that in the past several years, it has become a little bit more prevalent. I think more people have been showing it lately. Not sure, could be just because of news like Charlottesville and some of the other incidents that have happened over the past 5 years or so. But generally, most people really don't show that. It's more implicit measures that often provide the evidence, like if they're taking, surveys that are designed to get to this information. And part of the reason part of the problem with implicit attitudes is that's a little bit more harder to detect, right? And so like when people say that there's systemic racism and you're part of a group that maybe has never really experienced that and you really can't see it, that may be why there's some resistance to changing some of the systems, right? Because of the implicit, harder to detect forms of racism or structural things that have been designed over the years that have kind of tipped the balance in one way or another. Another form of prejudice is known as ageism. And we're actually going to hit on this again in the next chapter 2 when it comes to age discrimination in the workplace. But that's prejudice and discrimination or any type of bias against individuals solely based on their age. Maybe believing that someone can't do a job as well just because of their age. That's a form of prejudice, right? And the discrimination would come in is if you don't hire that person based on your bias or your prejudice, right? This is typically, against older adults. And then last thing on this slide is homophobia, right? Which is the prejudice and discriminations based on a person's sexual orientation. And remember, it could be actual membership in that group or perceived membership in that group. And then sexism. We in the chapter before last, we talked about gender identity, gender expression, that kind of stuff. But sexism is prejudice and discriminations against a person based either on their biological sex or their gender, right? And some common examples would include, what is the expectation for a particular gender role, right? How is that person supposed to act? If they are male gender and they're not acting like that, it could be a form of discrimination. Employment, education, women are paid much less than men. I forget exactly what I might get these numbers wrong. So I'm going to throw out some numbers, and it's approximation. I think it's like about roughly somewhere in the 70 to 80 cent area per dollar that a man receives is what a woman receives. And if the woman is of color, you could take another 15 to 20 cents off of that. So there's an example of a form of sexism, right? Women in general earn less pay, even if it's for the same type of work.
Yes.
Yes, it's very true. I forget, each year, I always remember this because each year there's a day in the year where they call it Equal Pay Day. And it's where, I forget how it goes. So I'm going to be quiet because I might give out some wrong information because I can't remember. Then there's the idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So, and that's where an expectation that's held by a person that alters his or her behavior in a way that tends to make it true. So in other words, stereotypes, move forward to expectations about the stereotype. You treat the person according to that stereotype or that expectation. Then that influences that person to act according to stereotypic expectations, which then confirms your stereotypical belief, right? So, trying to think of a good example. What comes to mind is like, well, I want to make sure I have a good example here. And I'm stuck. All right, maybe it'll come to me here in just a second. So then there's confirmation bias. We have talked about this before as well. And confirmation bias is basically, that's where we seek out information that supports our stereotypes and ignore information that's inconsistent with our stereotypes. Before, when we talked about confirmation bias, we were talking about it in the aspects of, information and the echo chamber, right? So I seek information that really only confirms my own belief systems. And it's the same thing with stereotypes and prejudice, right? Is that confirmation bias is an issue that can prevent a person from kind of breaking out of that belief system. So if you're surrounded by people that are telling you the same thing that you're believing, I'll give you an example. So this is a little bit of a controversial one, but confirmation bias was when George Floyd was initially killed in Minneapolis. And then all of these stories came out about his criminal history. And I can remember a member of my family, well, because I had seen a news report about one incident of which he had been accused that ended up being that it was not really the way it happened. And so a member of my family kind of made some comments about George Floyd and him being a criminal and all of this stuff, and mentioning all of these, and actually mentioned one of the things that I had already knew was not true. So I tried to talk to my family member about it, and ended up that conversation didn't really go that well. But then what it caused me to do was it caused me to do some more of my own research. And then in another situation in which there was another crime that he was accused of, one of the cops has since been busted for planting drugs on other people. And there's like 60 some odd cases that have been dismissed as a result of that. And so it kind of puts a different light on that. So when I was talking to my family member again, of course, they're stuck in their confirmation bias. They don't want to hear the new information that I'm providing. I'm like, well, no, wait a minute. I actually looked this up. I actually went and saw the police report, you know, because police reports, by the way, can be public, right? So it's kind of interesting if you get stuck in your confirmation bias and a person just really wants to believe something. It can be very difficult to break them out of that, because then they reject any evidence that's inconsistent, which can be a shame. That's why education can be a long and slow process sometimes. And then there's the notion of in-groups and out-groups. You know, in-groups, that's the group that we identify with or we see ourselves as belonging to. The out-group is actually the group that we view as being fundamentally different from us. And then there's in-group bias, right? And so that's prejudice and discrimination, because the out-group is perceived as different or less than, and we want to feel good about our groups, right? And then any forces that promote reconciliation between groups, you know, we need the expression of empathy, we need acknowledgement of past suffering on both sides, and then of course there also needs to be a halt of the destructive behaviors, right, between the groups, in order for there to be that kind of healing reconciliation. And then finally, I think one example of scapegoating that we can think of right now would be the rash in anti-Asian assaults and crime and behavior as the result of like the coronavirus and being perceived as being either Chinese or, you know, with people being, I mean, it could be as mild, and not that this is mild, but, you know, shouting at someone, hey, did you bring over the virus, to actually, you know, assaulting someone and causing physical harm, right? But that would be an example of scapegoating. So those individuals are being blamed for the pandemic, as an example. All right, and then there's aggression, and we're going to talk about that. So, and there's a couple of different types of aggression, right? So first of all, aggression is basically seeking to cause harm or pain to another person. That's aggression. Like, I'm coming after you, and my intent is to cause some type of harm. And there's hostile aggression, and that's where the aggression is actually motivated by feelings of anger, and there is an intent to actually cause physical harm or pain. For example, a bar fight, right? And then there's instrumental aggression, which is motivated by achieving a goal and does not necessarily involve the intent to cause harm or pain, right? But it's designed, like, for instance, spreading rumors or gossip would be an example of instrumental aggression. So hostile aggression is typically exhibited by males, typically. Instrumental aggression is typically displayed by females. And remember, I'm saying typically because both sides can do both, right? And then there's frustration aggression theory, and that's when, and that's the idea that when a person is prevented from achieving an important goal that they've set out, they become frustrated and aggressive. And so, and the definition of frustration in general is being blocked from a goal. One theory regarding aggression looks at it as far as our evolutionary process, right? And that men typically, as I said in the other slide, males typically show more aggression. And there's a sense of dominance, trying to protect a mate or perpetuate the male's genes, right? So you get in the way of my mate, I'm coming after you. You're a danger to the group, I'm coming after you, right? So this definitely seems to have an evolutionary input. And then, you know, there's different types of bullying that we do, right? Or that occur, not that we do, that humans do at times. And there's the simple term bullying, right? Which is picking on people, repeated negative treatment over time. It tends to be kind of like a continual process. And as has already been pointed out, when it comes to bullying and boys, they tend to engage in direct physical aggression, and girls tend to engage in those indirect social forms of aggression, like spreading rumors, ignoring, giving the cold shoulder, isolating. And then the effects on the victim, obviously, is decreased mental health, anxiety, depression. You hear about kids committing suicide, doing things like that, right? They're going to underperform in their schoolwork. They may be more withdrawn at home. You're going to see different symptoms of a person who's a victim of bullying. And then there is cyberbullying, which is, you know, one of the inventions of social media and the internet, right? And that's, again, repeated behavior that's intended to cause psychological or emotional harm to a person. And again, it shows to be more common in girls, although I think there's some evidence that males are engaging in this behavior as well. Just might look a little different. And then another thing I wanted to talk about too, there's the Kitty Genovese story, and this is from 1964. And this kind of emphasizes the bystander effect, which basically says that in the bystander effect, the more people that are around a situation in which someone else needs help, the less likely an individual is going to step up and actually do help. Because there's always that thought in their mind that, oh, well, this is going to be, someone else is going to take care of this. Or look at all these people. Somebody else has already called the police, or whatever the case may be. Because it's the belief that someone else is going to do it, right? And there's the idea of which there's the diffusion of responsibility, which is basically kind of what I'm describing, right? When no one in the group actually goes to help because responsibility is kind of spread throughout the group. And what happened to her was she was actually attacked and killed with a knife outside of her apartment building. And people heard it. They heard her scream for help, and no one did anything. And she ended up dying. So this is kind of an example of the bystander effect. And I'm sure you've read her story or stories in the book, in the text. And so, all right. Any questions so far? All right. So now we're going to move into prosocial behaviors, and some terms that I kind of want you to pick up on is, one is, what is prosocial behavior, right? And so prosocial behavior is voluntary behavior with the intent to help other people. And it's voluntary and usually without any expectation of reward. People are just doing it out of the goodness of their heart, right? And altruism is actually going a step further, right? When the costs outweigh the benefits of helping, right? When it's more inconvenient for me to help than it is for the benefit, and yet I am still doing it. Basically for altruistic reasons, right? So for example, for those that remember 9/11, after that happened, there was an emotional show, an enormous show of altruism, on the parts of first responders and a lot of ordinary people. It's been a long time since I've seen any videos on 9/11, but there's some really good news stories from back then of people really engaging in true altruism, going out of their way, not expecting any reward. And then there's empathy. And, empathy is the ability to put yourself in the other person's shoes, to understand how they may be feeling at the time, right? And people who are empathetic tend to make emotional connections with others, and they feel compelled to help at that point. And then altruism is that form of selfless helping that's not motivated by benefits. Feeling good afterwards is the consequence, right? It's not a cause. And then helping is self-serving because, and then the other idea is helping is self-serving because our egos are involved and we receive benefits. So there are some people that will help because, okay, I'll get the attention. Let's see, it looks like questions come in. Yes, one of your fellow students shared that I'm really good at being empathetic. For some reason, I can make everyone feel welcome, loved, and understood. And that's a perfect definition of an empathetic person. It's funny, one of the reasons, and I think I shared this at the beginning of the semester, because I totally understand that and get that. How I went on my path the way I went was, a friend of mine asked me to volunteer at an inpatient drug treatment center and to do like one-on-one stuff. Now here I am, I'm a layperson, no training. And I found the same thing. Like I found that I was able to be there for another person. It was kind of like this undiscovered talent. And I love doing therapy and counseling. And that interaction. Yeah, that's a good point. So what is it that happens when we're forming relationships? Like, what is the influence of that? Like, who am I going to be romantic with? Who am I going to be friends with, right? So there's a couple theories around that. One is proximity. And that's tends to be the people that you have the most contact with is who you're going to form some kind of relationship with, whether it be romantic or friendship, right? And then there's also similarity, right? So if they have similar backgrounds, attitudes, and similar lifestyles. And then there's the term that's homophily, which is the tendency for people to form social networks with others who are similar. Remember, homo being same. And then there's a couple of important components to relationships. One is reciprocity. In other words, there's give and take. It's funny, in family and marriage counseling, right? One of the things that sometimes we work on is, or that gets worked on, is what's known as the unfair bargain. And what the unfair bargain is that there is not reciprocity in the relationship. And certain people have their rules, and you do that. I come home from work and dinner should be on the table, and I should be able to, sit in my chair with my beer or whatever. And then when we're done eating, you clean up the dishes. That's kind of like the unfair bargain, right? And there's not a lot of reciprocity there. The other thing about important components in relationships is self-disclosure, right? And that's the sharing of information. And it makes it more intimate. So, and when I use the word intimate, right? So we can talk about intimate romantic relationships where there is physical intimacy, but then there's also, you know, an emotional, spiritual, or intellectual intimacy, right? That sharing of information. Anybody here that has a best friend, you have probably engaged in some kind of intimate information exchange, and you know, have some kind of intimate connection with them that's unique and special, right? Yeah, let's see. All right. And I want you guys to know this for the exam as well. And a couple things I want to point out. Actually, I'm going to turn on my laser pointer. So you see this term here. This is companionate love. So if you read it really fast, it might show as compassionate love. So make sure that you're not confusing this word with the word compassionate if you see it on the exam, right? And you should be able to recognize that companionate love is intimacy plus commitment. And then there is romantic love, which is passion plus intimacy. And then there's consummate love, which is intimacy plus passion plus commitment, right? Then you have liking, you have infatuation, you have fatuous love, which is passion plus commitment. And then there's empty love, where basically there's no passion, there's no intimacy, there's only commitment. Like we're staying together for the kids, and would be an example of empty love. And this was Sternberg's triangular theory of love. It's described, you know, with 7 types of love that's broken down into 3 components: the intimacy, the passion, and the commitment. So you will see some questions on the exam that will touch on the triangular theory of love. All right, and that concludes part 2 of chapter 12, social psychology.